Welcome to AKC's Story Loom. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, and comment, and turn on your post notification button as your support means a whole lot to me.
Now let's get right into the story.
A constant, biting presence in the village of Oakhaven felt different now. It carried not just the scent of pine and crisp mountain air, but the metallic tang of fear. Young Elara, barely 15 summers old, watched it whip through the narrow gaps between the huts, a cruel, invisible hand stirring the dust of their quiet lives. For weeks, a creeping sickness had been tightening its grip on Oakhaven. It started with a cough, dry and persistent, then came the fever, burning bodies from the inside out, followed by a lethargy so profound it swallowed the will to live. Elara's parents, once the pillars of their small world, his father, Bron, a blacksmith whose laughter echoed through the valley, and his mother Lyra, whose gentle hands wove the finest wool, were now reduced to shadows on their straw mat. Their breaths were shallow, rattling gasps that tore at Elara's heart. The village elder, old Man Theron, a fount of ancient wisdom and herbal remedies, had exhausted his knowledge. His tinctures and poultices, usually so potent, had no effect on this insidious blight. "There is but one hope, Elara." Theron had rasped, his voice raspy from too many nights of comforting the dying. "A legend, whispered among the highest peaks, the Yarsagumba. They say it can pull a soul back from the precipice of death itself." Elara had heard of the Yarsagumba. It wasn't just a legend, it was a myth woven into the very fabric of their mountain lives. Found only in the frigid high-altitude meadows of the Sky Splitter Mountain, a peak so treacherous it earned its name from the sheer, seemingly endless rock faces that clawed at the clouds. Tales of the Sky Splitter were not just of its deadly terrain, avalanches that swallowed entire valleys, crevasses that yawned into the abyss, and an air so thin it could choke the life from a man, but also of its spectral guardians, the mountain's fury, said to be the spirits of those who dared to trespass. No one from Oakhaven had ever returned from its upper reaches. But Theron's words had also mentioned other plants, less mythical but still vital. "And the arnica," he'd whispered, "for the internal bleeding the sickness seems to cause. And rhodiola to rekindle the spirit and strength that this malady drains. These, too, were said to cling to the higher slopes, though not as elusive as the Yarsagumba." The thought of facing the Sky Splitter alone was a cold knot in Elara's gut. He was strong for his age, agile from years of scrambling up lower slopes after errant goats, but he was no mountaineer. Yet, the image of his parents' fading eyes burned into his mind, a relentless goad. He would go. He had to. News of his desperate plans spread like wildfire through Oakhaven. 8 other youths, their families also ravaged by the sickness, stepped forward. There was Torvin, broad-shouldered and quiet, whose little sister lay comatose. Lyra's cousin, Finn, swift and nimble, his mother wasting away. The twins, Kael and Maeve, inseparable, their grandmother struggling for breath. Roric, the carpenter's son, with a grim determination etched on his face. Sera, small but fierce, her father's once booming voice, now a faint whisper. Joric, the hunter's apprentice, whose tracking skills might prove invaluable. And finally, Bron, the oldest of the group at 17, a natural leader with a practical mind, whose entire family had been struck down. 8 friends, 8 desperate souls, bound by a shared terror and a glimmer of impossible hope. Elara looked at their determined, if fearful, faces. This wasn't just his quest anymore. It was theirs. They gathered their meager supplies, smoked meat, dried fruit, thick wool blankets, rope, and pickaxes borrowed from the quarry. Old Man Theron gave them a small pouch of dried herbs, not for the sickness, but for their journey, a strong brew to warm them, a bitter paste for wounds. He looked at them, his ancient eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "The mountain demands a price," he warned, his voice barely audible. "Be ready to pay it." The morning they set off, the sun was a pale disk in the sky, swallowed by the brooding clouds that perpetually clung to the Sky Splitter's summit. The entire village stood by, silent, their faces etched with a profound sense of foreboding. As Elara took the first step onto the winding path that led into the foothills, a chill ran down his spine, unrelated to the mountain air. It was the chill of the unknown, of a journey into the heart of death itself, for a chance at life.
Beginning sets the stage for the perilous adventure to come. The first few days of the ascent were deceptively gentle. The path wound through a forest of ancient pines, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot. The air, though crisp, was still breathable, and the occasional glimpse of sunlight offered fleeting comfort. The camaraderie among the 9 friends was a shield against the growing trepidation. They shared stories, sang hushed songs, and helped each other over fallen logs and rocky streams. Bron, with his calm demeanor, took charge of rationing their food and water, while Joric's keen eyes spotted deer trails and hidden springs. But the mountain was merely biding its time. On the 4th day, the tree line receded abruptly, giving way to a landscape of stark, brutal beauty. Jagged peaks clawed at the perpetually overcast sky, and the ground became a chaotic jumble of loose scree and enormous boulders. The wind, no longer a mere breeze, became a relentless, shrieking entity, pushing against them with malevolent force. Snow, fine as dust, began to fall, swirling into blinding flurries. Their first true test came that afternoon. They were traversing a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for one person, when a sudden gust of wind, amplified by the funnel of a hidden gully, slammed into them. Sera, small and light, was caught off guard. Her foot slipped on a patch of black ice, and she cried out, her small frame teetering on the edge of a dizzying drop. Rope! Bron bellowed, reacting instantly. Elara, already quick, flung the coiled rope, but it wasn't enough. Sera slid, scrabbling for purchase, her fingers scraping against the unforgiving rock. Her scream echoed for a terrifying second before she vanished into the swirling white. A collective gasp, then stunned silence. Joric, his face pale with horror, rushed to the edge, peering down into the abyss, but the snow had swallowed her completely. The mountain had claimed its first victim. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by a cold, numbing fear. They continued in stunned silence, each step now weighted with the knowledge that the skysplitter was indeed a living, malevolent force. The climb grew steadily more arduous. The air thinned, making every breath a conscious effort. Their muscles screamed with exertion, and the cold seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. They huddled together at night, seeking warmth from each other, but sleep was fitful, haunted by the memory of Sera's scream. One morning, as they navigated a treacherous ice field, the ground beneath them shifted. A low rumble, deep in the mountain's belly, vibrated through the ice. Avalanche! Bron roared, his voice barely audible above the rising roar. Spread out. Find cover. Panic seized them. Torvin, big and strong, tried to pull Finn to safety, but the ground ripped open beneath them. A hidden crevasse, camouflaged by a thin layer of snow, opened like a hungry maw. Torvin, despite his strength, couldn't stop their fall. Their desperate cries were swallowed by the thunder of the snow and ice that followed. When the roar subsided, the world was blanketed in a fresh, pristine layer of snow, concealing the gaping hole that had just consumed 2 more of their friends. 3 now. 3 gone. The remaining 6 huddled together, shivering not just from the cold, but from the raw grief that gnawed at their resolve. Elara felt a hollowness in his chest, a growing void where hope once resided. Yet, the image of his parents, weak and gasping, pushed him forward. He had to keep going. He couldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. They stumbled on, their pace slowing, their spirits dampened by each loss. The twins, Kael and Maeve, usually a source of light-hearted banter, were now withdrawn, clinging to each other for comfort. Roric, his face grim and set, never spoke, his focus entirely on the next painful step. Days bled into one another. They found a few patches of arnica clinging to a sheltered rock face, its vibrant yellow flowers a stark contrast to the desolate landscape. Elara remembered Theron's words and carefully gathered them, crushing the blossoms to a paste, which they rubbed on their aching joints and frost-nipped skin. The temporary relief was a small mercy. One evening, huddled in a shallow ice cave, a blizzard raged outside, trapping them. Kael, always the more sensitive of the twins, began to shiver uncontrollably, his eyes glazed with fever. Maeve held him close, weeping silently. They had been exposed to the elements for too long, their bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion. "We need to push on," Bron urged, his voice heavy with despair. "We need that rhodiola. It's supposed to give strength." But the blizzard made movement impossible. By morning, Kael's breathing was shallow and ragged. Maeve, exhausted and heartbroken, lay beside him, her own strength failing. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the snow in dazzling diamonds, it illuminated a tragic scene. Kael was still. Maeve, too, had succumbed, her hands still clasped in her brother's. For more gone. Only Elara, Bron, Joric, and Roric remained. The mountain was taking its toll, demanding a price in lives for every foot they gained. The air was razor-sharp, cutting their lungs with every gasp. They were higher than any human from Oakhaven had ever dared to venture, and the Yarsagumba still seemed impossibly far away. Hope was a flickering flame, threatened by every gust of wind. The losses are mounting, and the physical and emotional toll is immense. How will the remaining four, particularly Elara, contend with the deepening despair and the relentless challenges of the skysplitter? The silence that followed the deaths of Kael and Maeve was more deafening than any blizzard. Elara, Bron, Joric, and Roric stood on the precipice of despair. 7 friends, gone. The weight of their loss pressed down on them, heavier than any pack. Elara looked at Bron, whose usually steady eyes now held a haunted, faraway look. Joric, once so sharp, moved with a slow, mechanical gait. Roric's face was a mask of grim determination, but his eyes held a profound weariness. "We have to keep moving," Bron rasped, his voice hoarse. "For them. For our families." The words were almost swallowed by the thin air, which felt like liquid fire in their lungs. They were at an altitude where every step was an agonizing battle. The ground was now a treacherous mix of solid ice sheets and drifts of deep, powdery snow that concealed unseen dangers. The wind howled incessantly, a constant, mocking reminder of the mountain's power. They pressed on, driven by a desperate, almost primal need. Their bodies were screaming in protest, but their minds, fueled by the image of their dying loved ones, pushed them forward. Elara's fingers, raw and bleeding from scrambling over rocks and ice, sought out purchase on the treacherous terrain. His vision swam at times, the lack of oxygen playing tricks on his mind, but he forced himself to focus. Then, Roric slipped. He had been leading, carefully testing the ice with his pickaxe. A hidden fissure, masked by the glare, opened up. He cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise and terror, as he plunged into the icy depths. They heard the sickening crunch of impact, then silence. Another one gone. The mountain continued to devour them. Now, only 3 remained, Elara, Bron, and Joric. The enormity of their losses, the sheer brutality of the mountain, threatened to crush their spirits entirely. Hope was a fragile ember, flickering in the gale. "We're almost there," Joric coughed, pointing a trembling finger upwards. Through a break in the swirling snow, Elara saw it, a plateau, higher than anything he had ever imagined, bathed in a strange, ethereal light. It was the place. The whispers said the Yarsagumba thrived there, in the most desolate and sacred of places. As they ascended the final, grueling climb, Joric, weakened by days of starvation and exposure, stumbled. Bron, despite his own exhaustion, tried to steady him, but Joric's legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto the snow, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. "Go," Joric wheezed, his eyes clouded. Don't let our deaths be for nothing." Bron hesitated, torn. To leave Joric was unthinkable, but to stay meant they all perished. Elara, tears freezing on his cheeks, remembered his parents' pale faces. He grasped Joric's hand, a silent farewell. Joric managed a weak nod, his gaze fixed on the endless sky. "We'll find it, Joric," Elara promised, his voice choked with emotion. "We'll save them." Then, with a heavy heart, Elara and Bron continued their agonizing climb, leaving Joric behind, a silent testament to the mountain's insatiable hunger. Finally, they reached the plateau. It was a desolate, wind-swept expanse of rock and ice, ancient and untouched. The air was thin, biting, and the silence was profound, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Elara's heart hammered against his ribs, not just from exertion, but from a growing sense of awe and dread. And then he saw it. Scattered across the frozen ground, nestled in small, sheltered depressions, were the first signs. Tiny, almost imperceptible protrusions from the earth, the Yarsagumba. Their color, a muted golden brown, blended perfectly with the frozen soil, making them nearly impossible to spot without an almost unnatural focus. Elara and Bron fell to their knees, their fingers, numb and clumsy, beginning to meticulously search. They dug with their bare hands, breaking through the frozen crust, their breath misting in the frigid air. Each unearthed specimen was a victory, a precious shard of hope. They worked tirelessly, ignoring the cold, the hunger, the overwhelming exhaustion, until they had a small, but significant, collection. As they gathered the last of the Yarsagumba, Elara spotted something else. Tucked into a rocky crevice, surprisingly vibrant against the bleak backdrop, was a patch of rhodiola, its thick, gnarled roots clinging stubbornly to life. He remembered Theron's words, to rekindle the spirit and strength. They harvested it, a vital addition to their desperate cure. With their precious cargo carefully wrapped and secured, a fragile sense of triumph mingled with the profound sorrow. They had faced the skysplitter, and in a way, they had won. But the cost, the immense, heartbreaking cost. The descent was a blur of pain and exhaustion. They stumbled, slid, and occasionally fell, picking themselves up each time, driven by the desperate hope they carried. Bron, always the stoic, finally began to falter, his energy completely spent. Elara, seeing his friend's fading strength, pushed him, urged him on, recounting the faces of their families, the sacrifices of their friends. Days later, a gaunt, ghostly figure, Elara staggered into the outskirts of Oakhaven. He was alone. Bron had succumbed just hours before, his body giving out within sight of the lower slopes. Elara's clothes were in tatters, his skin cracked and raw from frostbite and exposure, his eyes sunken and haunted, reflecting the emptiness of the mountain. The village elders and healers rushed to him, their faces a mixture of shock and profound relief. He could barely speak, but he extended his hand, revealing the carefully preserved Yarsagumba and rhodiola. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The legendary cure, brought back from the impossible. The healers worked quickly, preparing potent brews. Elara collapsed, his mission fulfilled, the weight of the mountain and its sacrifices finally pressing him into unconsciousness. When he awoke, the first thing he saw was his mother's face, pale but peaceful, a faint flush returning to her cheeks. His father, though weak, was stirring, his breathing slow and even. The fever had broken. The sickness was receding. Elara wept then, tears of relief and sorrow, for his parents, for Torvin, Finn, Kael, Maeve, Roric, Sera, Joric, and Bron. Their names echoed in the silent corners of his mind, a solemn testament to the skysplitter's immense price. He had brought back life, but he carried the ghosts of 8 friends, forever bound to the unforgiving mountain that had demanded so much. The village was saved, but Elara was forever changed, a living monument to the ultimate sacrifice, a boy who had ventured into death's domain and returned with a fragile, precious victory. The news of Elara's return, and more importantly, the Yarsagumba and rhodiola he clutched, spread like wildfire through Oakhaven. A fragile, desperate hope, long extinguished by the creeping sickness, flickered back to life in the eyes of the remaining villagers. The healers, guided by old Man Theron's meticulous instructions, immediately began preparing the potent brews. Every precious root and segment of the legendary fungi was carefully measured, ground, and steeped. Elara, after being nursed back from the brink of his own collapse, witnessed the miracle he had bought with so much pain. His mother, Lyra, who had been fading, slowly began to regain color in her cheeks. Her breathing, once a shallow rattle, deepened, becoming steady and calm. His father, Bran, though still weak, stirred with a new vitality, a faint tremor of his old strength returning to his hands. The same scenes unfolded across Oakhaven. Coughs subsided, fevers broke, and the profound lethargy that had swallowed wills began to recede. The village, once a place of silent mourning, was filled with the soft sounds of renewed life, faint murmurs, gentle sighs of relief, and even, eventually, tentative laughter. Elara, still frail and bearing the visible scars of the skysplitter on his body and in his haunted eyes, became a silent focal point of this resurgence. Villagers, their faces etched with gratitude and awe, would approach him with bowed heads and tearful thanks. They brought him the finest cured meats, freshly baked bread, and warm, hand-knitted blankets. They cleared his family's land, repaired their home, and ensured they lacked for nothing. But it wasn't just material rewards. Elara was no longer just young Elara, the blacksmith's son. He was Elara of the Skysplitter, the one who had faced death and returned. A reverence settled around him, a quiet respect that transcended mere gratitude. Children whispered his name, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. The elders sought his counsel, not for mundane matters, but for deeper insights into resilience and the strength of the human spirit. Yet, this new status was a heavy cloak. Every kind word, every gesture of thanks, was a fresh reminder of the 8 empty places beside him, of the friends who had paid the ultimate price for this fragile peace. The quiet celebration of life in Oakhaven was underscored, for Elara, by the deafening silence of those who had not returned. He had saved his village, but he carried the Skysplitter within him, a permanent monument to his impossible victory and devastating loss. We've come to the end of the story. What did you learn in the story? What are your thoughts and lessons? Please kindly drop in the comments section. Thank you and God bless you.